Pues muy buenos días, qué bueno que están aquí nuevamente en nuestra última conferencia del ciclo, del gran ciclo de Historia de las Emociones, y estamos cerrando con broche de oro con nuestro invitado de hoy, que es un gran historiador de las emociones, de la experiencia, de la ciencia, de la medicina, especialista también en temas que tienen que ver con el dolor, con la experimentación médica, y pues su trabajo tiene mucho de interdisciplinario, de transdisciplinario. Realmente estamos muy contentas, Susana Sosenski y yo, de tenerte esta mañana, Rob. I know your Spanish maybe not may not be
I
very
followed all of that. That was wonderful.
okay. And bienvenido. Voy a leer una breve nota de Rob para quien no lo conoce tanto en México, y que por cierto hay una muy buena noticia, pues pronto su libro, uno de sus grandes libros, estará traducido al español, la historia de las emociones y la experiencia. Espérenlo próximamente, que ya está en eso. Y voy a leer una breve nota para escucharte. Te agradecemos muchísimo, Rob, que estés aquí. Susana Sosenski se disculpa, tuvo un problema médico, pero sabemos que está allí siempre al pie del cañón. Y bueno, yo le agradezco muchísimo a ella también este gran ciclo que hemos tenido a lo largo del año, que sin duda ha sido muy exitoso y muy sugerente. Voy a leer brevemente la nota biográfica de Rob. Él es escritor, viajero y corredor también, músico, y es profesor que vive entre Montreal, Canadá y Finlandia. Es autor y editor de más de 14 libros de historia, de historia, ¿sí? Y también de varios artículos, capítulos en libros y reseñas. Sus libros han sido traducidos a más de 10 lenguas. Ya les había ahora comentado que lo tendremos próximamente al español. Y bueno, pues como había dicho, él ya es profesor investigador en el Centro de Excelencia, bueno, voy a decirlo en inglés, The Finland Center of Excellence in History of Experiences en la Universidad de Tampere, en Finlandia, pero también ha sido profesor en Berlín, en Harvard, en McGill, en el Max Planck Institute, y bueno, en muchos otros lugares. Es miembro también de la Royal Historical Society y de Finnish Historical Society. Entonces, pues realmente es un privilegio tenerte esta mañana, Rob, con nosotros, y welcome to Mexico, welcome to Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, and we are looking forward to listening to you. Thank you very much for finishing your your long day with us. So relax and just share what you want to share with this Latin American audience that will be very happy to listen to you. Thank you. Hola, María.
So thank you for the introduction. I wish I was in Mexico. I would be a lot warmer for one thing. But it's a pleasure to talk to you. And I hope this caps nicely what's already a very important series. I think not just for Latin American audience, but for a general audience in our field. It's a good job you've done here. I'm just going to share my screen. 1 second.
Yes, thank you.
And hopefully this works. Everybody good with that? Okay, so the history of experience. I'm going to start here with the lived, because it's not always clear what this means. And I'm going to take you back to begin with, almost 20 years to 2006, when I was freshly minted postdoc in Berlin. And I was immensely privileged at that point to have a very large office and a very small class, which meant that I could teach in my office. So we had 10 to 12 students around a table, teaching in a Socratic style, and it was amazing. My office conditions have been on the decline ever since. And I'm living in the memory of these formative pedagogical moments. So what were we doing back then? My 10 to 12 students in my office, we were, amongst other things, forensically examining Plato's Republic in its entirety, which was an enormous challenge for me at that point, an enormous challenge for the students, and we were, in good Platonic fashion, groping for the light. So, the Republic, I'm probably not telling anything you don't know, contains this passage about a society imagined living in an illuminated cave. The light source here is a hidden fire, but the cave dwellers mistake it for the sun. And the light casts shadows of objects on the wall. And the cave dwellers mistake those objects for mistake those shadows for the objects themselves. And based on what they can see, they act according to the illusion that they know what's happening. And the reality is that they do not know the true light, and they do not know the true forms of the objects, and they therefore actually understand nothing. Now, reading this, we understood that the first step toward leaving this cave was to come to know that, in fact, you were in it in the first place. These Platonic cave dwellers could, through a severely difficult process, leave the cave, probably wrestled out of it by a philosopher into the light. And when they got into the light, this light of the sun, when compared to the light of the cave, would be blinding and it would be painful. And the path to knowledge and understanding was going to be a path of pain. The reward, though, was truth. The illusory experience of life in the cave would then become apparent for what it was. And there was no going back unless you went back to rescue others from this cave. Now, these classroom discussions in 2006, it seems quaint and naive now. They took place before Twitter existed, let alone X. Facebook was only in its first phase of expansion from US college campuses. The iPhone didn't exist. YouTube had just been bought by Google, but basically nobody was sharing videos. And nobody had a camera on their phone. So we were all basically living an analog life. And honestly, that cave analogy in Plato rang hollow. My students back then were still very much romantically embracing the end of history, liberal democracies, sweeping clean of the countries from which many of them came. So these were students from Russia and Ukraine and Romania, Baltic states, former sort of Soviet satellite states in Central Asia. And it was easy, it seemed to us, in 2006, to rely on seeing as believing as truth. Our time and our place were already outside the cave, for sure. And we were already able to comprehend the limitations of an experience that were built on mere opinion and belief. So those students, I think, in their own minds, were already philosopher kings. And as their teacher, my goodness, I was Socrates. So now the end of history was a myth, of course, and it remains, however, a popular fiction, as seen in the work of Steven Pinker and others. We were far too sanguine about our superiority to the cave-bound imagined community. And honestly, I think that today it would be far easier to teach this stuff in the post-truth world that's framed by Trumpism and social media politics and AI deepfakes and Fox News and ChatGPT, and the discovery of a sort of widespread incapacity of whole populations to be able to sort out blatant falsehood from demonstrable truth, or even to care which is which. So now I think the idea that most people are cave dwellers is an easy sell. In 2006, it was not. I don't know if anybody now can be entirely secure in their conviction that the things that they experience are as they are. Both public and private experience are now dominated by the primacy and validity of what seems real to me. Lived experience is not objective experience, but it's becoming incredibly difficult to gainsay lived experience. So what is it? What is lived experience? The human is always already located in time and place and space. Lived experience pertains to what it is like as such a located subject to go through the world. So that's experience in a very literal definition, to go through, experire. Its livedness differentiates experience from that which actually happened in a sort of Rankian sense. But from a subjective point of view, it is what actually happened. It's not merely a point of view. An individual subject's perception of what they've gone through is woven through with their beliefs and expectations and predictions, conditioning, concepts, their understanding of the world, their conceptual repertoire, material affordances, and you could add maybe 1,000 other things to this list, including their affective training and their experience. So it's embodied, it's embrained, shaping synaptic pathways and sensory signaling out of plastic human material. And since this experience of whatever it is real to the person experiencing it, they make judgments and they make decisions according to this reality. And from this are formed practices, policies, all manner of actions, some of it inconsequential and a lot of it consequential. Now, a kind of ecological perspective of the future of historiography was already elaborated some time ago with magisterial, and I think because of this, eminently ignorable grandeur by Dominic Le Capra. And what he did was to displace the centrality of human intention and instead form a question about where intention comes from in the first place. And so this is an ecological view, not in the sense of sort of post-human environmental concern, but ecological in the sense of the ultimate relatedness of everything. Now, Le Capra's work was foreshadowed here by the neurohistorical project of Daniel Lord Smale, and similar but less developed ideas by Lynn Hunt. Now, this work never quite resolves the fundamental tension between evolutionary adaptation of the human brain with a sense of the underlying biological mechanism and the inescapable fact that culture is writing to nature all the time. But over time, Smale in particular distanced himself from the biological universal and made a probabilistic move in his interpretive method. Since human brains are kind of they're situated in a kind of psychotropic soup, That's a choice phrase. I don't mean just sort of hallucinogenic drugs, but everything from the consumption of cheap print to the consumption of caffeine, or alcohol, to the prevalence of lead or other contaminants in the industrial atmosphere, right down to the advent of the sort of online mind. And from these sort of observations about what's being consumed, sort of willfully or otherwise, it should be possible to say what human experience was like according to the conditions of its existence, whilst acknowledging that we are always in this soup of psychotropic influences ourselves, even as we try to make claims for our neutrality, or our objectivity.
Mhm.
Now, this macro level approach is complemented by a number of studies that take a micro-historical approach to situated experiential change, driven by new practices in media or rituals or in new sensory landscapes. So that what the human is and how the human feels is bound up with what the human eats, and drinks, and breathes, and reads,
Mhm.
and otherwise consumes, and what all this consumption means and how all this consumption is practiced. So experience then, thinking through all of this and thinking through the sort of post-truth world online, is ultimately something lived in a brain-body world dynamic. Now, I think that all of these approaches supply a nice level of granularity and at least potentially empirical substance to Sarah Ahmed's theoretical notion of the stickiness of emotional objects. I've always been a fan of Sarah Ahmed. I think her work is profoundly insightful about the way that value and power inheres in the relationality and approach to things, and the way in which meanings get stuck, and I would add, come unstuck from objects and people and things in the world. But the multidisciplinary approach to the dynamics of lived experience affords all of us an insight into what, practically speaking, this stickiness is. For while you can talk of shared values and cultural memory and institutionalized rituals and meanings and things like feeling rules and sensory scripts, all of it makes no sense at all without factoring humans in the flesh. Bodies and brains. Bodies and brains that are in the world, not separate from it and not prior to it. So how reality seems, whether it turns out to be sort of mere shadow play, or maybe it's something more tangible, it has an embodied effect, which in turn has worldly consequences, and the worldly consequences have a bodily effect, and so on, and round and round. It becomes requisite not to point out the unreality of people's perception, not to call out the deludedness of the online mind, as if they were living life in a Socratic cave. Rather, to account for human meaning-making and human practices in their cave life, whenever, wherever it may be, according to its perception as real. And that leads me to a new slogan. T-shirts will be printed soon. Wie es eigentlich erschienen ist. I apologize for introducing the Germanic, but it seems to me necessary. I'll come to an explanation. The neurohistorical turn seems to have been caught up and in fact superseded by the socio-cultural turn in the neurosciences. And this in turn has fed back onto what historians might think that they can do with the history of emotions and senses and perception and experience in general. And it's really fascinating to note how quickly the scene has shifted. So in 2006, Daniel Gross was, offering a scathing and eviscerating broadside against the way in which emotion science was hiding its flaws and assumptions. And he was scolding those in the humanities and social sciences who were flocking to the cutting edge of this science, like magpies to shiny things. And Roger Cooter similarly was sort of firing heavy artillery at historians who were signing up to this kind of stuff, asking what was the point in historians and the humanities in general if the human was being reduced to a self-working biology, or worse, an evolutionary psychology. And when I joined the Center for the History of Emotions in Berlin in 2011, I think it's right to say that the idea of collaborating with the psychologists and the neuroscientists who were present then in that building was already pretty much dead. And it made cohabitation a little bit awkward at times. But that was then. If we fast forward, we find 11 years later in 2017, Daniel Gross publishing this book, Uncomfortable Situations, in which he was trying to capture a cross-disciplinary conversation about emotion that he thought was inconceivable a decade earlier, but which had become absolutely imperative. Gross before had been determined that the humanities shouldn't be included in emotion research if it was going to be a sort of secondary partner, an underling to the real science. He thought we should be stakeholders. And after that, his critique was joined by many others, demanding that emotion science and computational psychology take account of situated emotion and situated cognition. And some of those voices were coming from neuroscience itself, and that was very useful. So I single out this one, a work edited by Sapana Chowdhury and Jan Slaby on critical neuroscience. And Chowdhury said in this work that it is not clear how neural processes manage to realize subjective experience, nor is there consensus about the relationship between neural processes and cognitive, social, and emotional capacities captured in their full complexity. And she asked whether these, what to her were philosophical conundrums, whether they were sensible questions to ask of a science of the nervous system. And that's a useful critique. And she said that it was actually a part of the problem to expect a scientific solution to the big riddle of humanity. This big riddle of humanity, it turns out, you needed the humanities to answer it. Now, I think this is 2012, we're a lot further on in many respects. It's not so much that the full complexity has now been captured, but that many different disciplines, including neuroscience itself, have acknowledged that questions concerning the riddle of humanity cannot be answered by any single discipline. Mm-hmm. The realization that there is a relationship between neural processes and the social and cultural is itself significant, because it invites talk of radical collaboration, which I'm in favor of, even if making that collaboration happen is difficult and uncomfortable and full of problems. So if we take, for example, a statement that emanates from Lisa Feldman Barrett's School of Social Neuroscience, saying that the brain, aggregating experience as it develops, hones the ability to construct predictions efficiently and according to the concepts of its culture, and that this accounts for the highly variable and context-dependent nature of notion, then this is a sort of view of the predictive processing model of the brain, demands, I think, a decentering of the brain in the neuroscientific argument, since it's so absolutely entangled with this question of the concepts of its culture. So it feels to me like this brings us to the brink of something important and collaborative and dynamic. I need to say what predictive processing is, because it's been fundamental in this shift in the last 10 years. It might best be described as the brain body's constant process of adjustment of a model of reality based on the gap between what the brain expects and what actually happens. And the most important element here is that predictive models have to allow for a changeability in the external world. On the whole, the neuroscientific approach to predictive processing emphasizes continuity. That makes sense. The brain makes predictions based on prior expectations. And this process generally works because what has happened tends to be what does happen in similar situations. But it also has to account for cultural change. Otherwise, there'd be no chance of predictive error. The brain would always be right, and we wouldn't need to have this conversation. Because of this instability here, what ends up being felt and expressed in the world has an effect, and it alters the world, and that feeds back on this internal feeling. So you end up with this unstable dynamic relation between what's happening on the inside and what's happening on the outside. So this is where I say it makes sense to think only of this biocultural dynamic and less about the sort of biology and the cultural duality. And once cultural and biological plasticity are factored into the fabric of human experience, it becomes absolutely vital that all the relevant disciplines here have a stake in the research of human experience. So historians have been forthcoming. They haven't necessarily been invited to contribute to this sort of neuroscientific endeavor, but they have weighed in anyway. Most of the pioneering moves so far have come from ancient historians. I'm not sure why. I think maybe it's their source materials, their particular sort of scarcity and interpretive method makes them open to kind of innovative theories and methods. But whatever it is, people like Esther Eidenau have been inspired, and they have pointed to a biocultural future in historiography, forwarding the claim especially that cultures are cognitive networks. And here I think it's necessary to say the reverse, that cognitive networks are cultures. So scholars like Eidenau have understood this predictive processing turn as a tipping point in the cognitive sciences that restores beliefs, expectations, and other meaningful attributions to the center of human experience formation, putting the mind and the body into an ecological relationship with the world. And this, I have this companion slide here of Thomas Fuchs, because this is really what is also coming out of neurophilosophy at the same time. Thinking historically, according to Eidenau and others, it means that the ideational, movement, and sensory context of ancient people, and I would say historical people wherever and whenever, cannot be thought of as surface level phenomena to be accounted for by uniformly operating cognitive and brain processes, but rather as necessary components of a network of constraint that contributes to locally distinctive sensibilities and their interpretation. So if you want to drill down to experience, yes, you need cognitive and brain accounts. You need to understand the crude stuff that you're dealing with. But you also need the humanities and social science accounts. And just to underscore this point, it's not simply that brain function is shaping culture and belief and so on, but that belief and other cultural phenomena are shaping experience through effects on brain function. Now, most importantly, this theoretical coordination in a transdisciplinary space is having, I think at least, or maybe I hope, a revolutionary effect on the kinds of history that can be written. So you've got things like experiences of dreams, experiences of pre-modern therapies that have been previously written off as just placebos, experiences of smellscapes or of faith or of collectivity or shared experiences of disease, and so on. These are now emerging as distinct historiographic possibilities. If you stick with a presentist preoccupation with contemporary emotion categories, you're going to find them smashed up on the rocks of this historical contextual complexity, such that experience must perforce actually include all kinds of feeling and thought and perception, knowledge and belief systems, all manner of cultural codes, expressions, material affordances, and situated practices. What a given culture tends to think of how the human body works will have a massive impact on the experience of having such a body. So the Platonic soul, or the humoral body, if to take two connected examples, cannot be shoehorned into the cosmological frame of reference of modern secular physiology or psychology, for example. So you can look at this piece. I wrote about this in A History of Feelings too. It matters. It has consequence if you think Eros got the better of you in ancient Greece. And it matters if you think your temperamental inclination to melancholy literally refers to an imbalanced mixture of substances in the body in favor of black bile. These knowledge and belief systems impact on how you feel in that place and time. When this is what you know, you will act accordingly, and so will everyone else around you who also knows it. Your practices will be directly tied to this knowledge, and so will your experience. Now, very usefully, and quite recently, this year, really only a few months ago, I think, Marie Van Haster in Emotion Review insisted that we pay closer attention to the tight and affective engagement of actors with their social material environment, because the transparency of the coupling between actors and their environment allow for a more exhaustive understanding of the working of emotives, of emotional sharing, and of emotive failure. And her plea here at heart is a plea for multidisciplinary collaboration. But it also represents a significant synthesis of the development of the history of emotions, uncomfortable entanglement with neuroscience and psychology, starting with William Reddy through Monique Shear to my work with Mark Smith. And responding to a call from cognitive philosopher Giovanna Colombetti to further our understanding of what makes certain emotional manifestations more stable across some cultures than others, Van Haster prompts historians to explore stability and continuity to show how stable experiential patterns emerge and become so ingrained that they may start to seem inborn. I really like this as if naturalness. That also echoes Sarah Ahmed. While not neglecting the simple truth that experiential patterns also change and disappear. This tension, which often seems not to exist in scientific research that lacks either a temporal or a geographic axis, is critical to the future of research into human experience across the disciplines, because it denaturalizes the present just as much as it defamiliarizes the past. So in sum, people act on the basis of what their reality is or was. Reality as real to them, not in any objective sense of reality. What it feels like to be human, how reality is perceived as human, is situated, it's contingent, it's mutable. Subjective, lived experience among humans is always couched in intersubjectivity and in the collective. And this is how meaning is derived, how meaning is shared and confirmed and reproduced. It also permits an assessment of relative authenticity. References to my lived experience, or worse, it's a toxic phrase for our times, my truth, are appeals to those who will validate my truth as the truth. And it's the consensus here, which is collectively formed, intersubjectively maintained, that underscores and underwrites the reality of cave life for those living in it. Collective agreement, confirmation is the basis for stability, or else it is the cause of a continuance of instability. And obviously this implies that lived experience is never outside of the dynamics of power. It's framed, it's delimited, it's defined, and it's scripted by a context that is in turn haunted by agencies of power and authority and by the legacies that they leave. These agencies need not be people, much less do they need to be philosopher kings or puppet masters, but they are social logics, technologies, systematic limitations, and institutionalized conceits. This amounts to something like an historical lived experience theory of social practice and power. So historiographically, and this is all by way of a long-winded explanation, this is history not wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, how it actually was by the Rankian dictum, but history wie es eigentlich erschienen ist, history as it actually seemed, and it's giving primacy to history as it actually seemed. All right. 3. I want to get some practicalities here. And they coalesce around what I'm calling the breach. And the following question. What about those who are denied collective confirmation and denied reproduction of their lived experience? So those whose life as it seems to be is invalidated. If a subject is alone in their feeling of injustice, the actions following from and formative of their lived experience will see them rejected, ostracized, confined, pathologized, invalidated, and otherwise excluded from that which everyone else around loosely agrees is real life. If we are to be able to unpick the political construction of the normativity of lived experience, we have to look for it in the breach afforded by the others, by the outliers' challenge to it. So thinking methodologically, we face this problem that millions of lives appear in the record obliquely through their interaction with authorities, be it the courts or the police or the church, and they leave scant trace of their own point of view. All those who, for whatever reason, race, gender, age, belief, have been cast out from society or otherwise suppressed or ostracized or had their humanity denied, tend not to leave much of a trace of their own experience. Otherwise silent and invisible lives become visible because they challenge or become engaged by some other agency of power. This is what I call the breach. It's that moment of contact. Here a life appears that was already there, but hitherto undocumented. And there are many forms of this breach. And when it happens, it doesn't reveal lived experience as it was, but they capture the process and sometimes the moment of experiential change. And in each case, I imagine the moment, if I go back to my main theme here, I imagine the moment at which the cave dweller first feels the philosopher shove them in the back, or take his hand. So the process of the breach isn't, it doesn't begin with seeing the light, let's say, but with encounter and with interaction between the experience of the powerless and the experience of the powerful. And it's this moment, it's not necessarily pleasant. Oftentimes it's probably unpleasant, that lived experience is suddenly framed by what it is not. The moment when lived experience is suddenly presented with an alternative. The moment where innocence maybe is lost, but also the moment that innocence can be conceived as such. For it's only in the moment when innocence is lost that it becomes clear that innocence is what it was. Obliquely, then, it's the moment when invisible becomes visible, but already receding into the distance. Whatever group is the focus, the process of the breach reveals something that was not immediately clear before, and underscores where the balance of power lies in the collective agreement about what counts as real. In every case, the emergent engagement with an agency of power and authority that had been exclusive reveals the excluded in the terms of that powerful agent, even if and when the moment is defined by its oppositional stance. So, for example, the slavery reformer asks on behalf of the slave, am not I a man and a brother? And the slave, maybe, in turn, appropriates this question, the idea of a common humanity, the concept of fraternity, and perhaps demands the freedom to join the community that had hitherto been exclusive, but to join it on that community's own shifting terms, or perhaps the demand is made on his behalf. In other cases, there is a clear refusal when the opportunity is offered to join according to the terms of the powerful other, as a rejection of the violence of the other's categories of inclusion, whether that's sympathy or happiness or civilization. Some very good examples if you want to see what I'm talking about here. Nonetheless, the moment of engagement, the moment of the breach, is the moment at which the unheard becomes heard, or when bare life is designated meaningful life. Homo sacer, the man apart, registers ethical debate at the point at which the body politic debates whether he or it is, at least potentially, like them. The early feminist, per the work of Joanna Burke, asks, are women animals? Thereby disrupting the orthodox definition of both the category man and the category animal, and by pleading to join the former, co-opts and disrupts its terms. For any group, women, children, working class men, imperial subjects, slaves, immigrants, undocumented workers, the acquisition of knowledge about or claims of rights or freedom or status or even simple species identity, I am human, frames those categories as belonging to the master group, changing not only the master group, but the excluded category at the same time. In each case, the moment of gain, or the moment at which such a gain is requested or demanded, implicitly outlines an experience in the process of disappearance. Now, this happens all the time to me. I hear historians talking about reading between the lines, listening to silences, amplifying the presence of absence. And I often am compelled to ask, how do you do that? In finding and analyzing the moment and the process of the breach, I propose that we can read for implicit evidence of lived experience not only lost, but never recorded. And this is imaginative work, to be sure, but it needs to be done. This is to engage the historical record precisely where there is an absence of people telling us how they felt. It's achieved through the tethering of the historical imagination to context and anchoring it to specifics. And I say, let there be uncertainty and let there be mess. Let faithful historicism result in partial answers and partial understanding, because it's better than nothing. So to recapitulate, I'm attempting to theorize how experience, the living of reality as given, is formed in context, fractures in context, changes in context. In Platonic terms, the cave dweller is dragged or drags himself into the light, and the realization of true knowledge and true understanding is a source of suffering and discomfort. The historiographical analogy concerns the dynamics of experiential change, illuminating the moment of fracture when a novel claim to lived reality exposes the political construction of prevailing experiential hegemony. Points of crisis then provide a glimpse of lived reality in the moment its naturalness is exposed as artifice. And this leads me to a very brief conclusion with a very provocative title. The conclusion is about the implications of all of this for the historian's practice. Now, I am in accord with Joan Scott's famous rejection of historians who employ their own experience as evidence for the experience of past actors. But I go further than Scott in rejecting her own discursive meta-narrative. There are no essential priors in historical research. There is nothing about my humanness that affords me insight into humanity per se. I am quite prepared to find continuity. I am quite prepared to find familiarity, but I am not prepared to assume it. The history of lived experience, I suggest, is not antagonistic to, and it's not antithetical to, an empirical bent. Apart from a clear insistence on archival fidelity, its recruitment of and critical engagement with social neuroscience and other disciplines, I think, is an expanded appeal to empiricism. The historian's imagination can only work effectively when tethered to context, anchored in specifics. Any implicit or tacit appeal to some kind of universal foundation or to some untested assumption arising from the historian's own political or identitarian concerns must be rejected if it overrides or undercuts the available evidence for the period and the place and the people in question. Now, Clifford Geertz, one of my heroes, I don't mind admitting, once wrote that there is no magical intrusion into the experience or the felt life of another, and nor is there a straightforward way to describe expressions of experience. We have to work out not only the ways in which past actors put their experience into circulation, in Geertz's words, but infer circulated experience to which there is no direct access. Geertz told ethnographers that they cannot live other people's lives and that it's a piece of bad faith to try. I hold out the same warning to historians who are charged with an optimistic overestimation of the power of their own empathy. Empathy is not a tool fit for purpose, either for the history of emotions or for the history of experience. And I end by saying this: empathy, a sort of tacit faith in empathy as an essential human prior, might just be the principal barrier to historical understanding. And I will leave it right there. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Rob. I really find everything you said just very, very suggestive, wonderful, and thank you. I really appreciate your talk. Maybe we can open the Zoom. Alonso, ¿podemos abrir el Zoom para ver si hay preguntas? Por favor, y ver la pantallita para ver si alguien quiere preguntar. We're waiting for the audience to ask. ¿Alguien de aquí tiene preguntas? No, Augusto no, Javier no. Bueno, I really loved this provocative end of your talk. I like it very, very much. I mean, we have to be very careful when we talk about empathy, and I think it's very dangerous to be empathic with past subjects, as you have explained us. But anyway, what about how can historians how do you say acompañar, like be with the subjects they study, you know? How, when I was listening to you, I was thinking like, how can we get into the brains and the neurological processes that were inside those brains? No, I mean, now we have this more difficult challenge. If looking for feelings and sensations is difficult, how can you get into those neurological processes? But when you talked about reconstructing what they were smelling or what they were breathing or what they were maybe perceiving, the sources will not tell that, but you can imagine that, right? I have a question there.
Well, maybe this, I mean, everything depends on the where and when, of course. I think in lots of instances, the sources can tell you, but I think that what any particular historian can learn from the sources, whatever they are, really depends upon the qualities and the training of that particular historian. So this gets down to the very nitty-gritty of how historians are trained.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened through, I think, from the 1990s, certainly into the 2010s, at least in the context that I'm familiar with, doctoral training of historians became incredibly narrow, so that people were becoming very adept at dealing with a particular kind of source in a particular kind of place in a very narrow period. And and that can be good for all kinds of purposes, but if what you're wanting to do is reconstruct a context, then it's probably insufficient to be so narrow. And so narrow in terms of period and narrow in terms of the kinds of source that you can analyze. Because it seems to me that if we want to understand, if we want to be able to infer experience, and I really think that's what we're doing, right? Because we don't get to put these sorts of past actors in fMRI scanners, right? That's a fantasy.
Yeah.
So all we have is the world to work back from. We have the insight from the neurosciences about how biological plasticity works, but we don't have any actual people. we've only got the world to work back from. And
Yeah.
if that world as we reconstruct it is in various forms of incompleteness, and it will always be incomplete, but there are degrees of incompleteness. And if you're just looking at one kind of source for one kind of place, you know, you're going to be more incomplete than someone who can look at um, not just court records, but also church records, and also art records, and also life writing, and also material culture, and so on and so on. And I think that we may need to double down on our emphasis in training on generalism in the way that history gets practiced. Because I'm not suggesting anything radically new here. Like the results might seem innovative and new, but the methods are really rigorously empirical. They're asking for more empiricism, in fact, and maybe less specialism, and maybe a bit more interdisciplinary reading and engagement. But I think that the divisions we make for ourselves between, say, emotions history and intellectual history and religious history and the history of science and political history and social history are unproductive divisions.
Yeah.
And maybe we need to do all of it. And I'm not suggesting that's easy, far from it, but it's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be hard.
Yes, but that's what I find really wonderful in your work. This intent to like integrate in an experience, body, mind, all the dimensions of where you are living and the world outside. What does the world outside produces inside you? And as you said before, maybe we should start training our students and ourselves in this imaginative methodological or methodological interpretation, which has been very bad seen before, like using imagination or trying to perceive what people from the past perceived was very bad seen in many corrientes historiográficas before these times.
Yeah, well, I think that this point about the historical imagination is really key. So when I was an undergraduate in the 1990s, and so um, it was impossible to avoid discussions of the historical imagination. Everyone read Hayden White, and because of that, everyone read Collingwood, and the kind of post-modernity kind of abandon was very much at the forefront. And I think that it was really necessary to throw out a lot of what the postmodern turn was doing. And I think that sometimes some of the good stuff accidentally got thrown out with it. And I don't think there's too much emphasis anymore on the historical imagination or what it takes to have one. It's not something that you sort of sit by yourself and simply divine from your own status as a kind of thinking human. But it's an incredibly tethered skill to have an historical imagination and for it to be plausible. And I think that we maybe as a discipline have been afraid of that category, plausibility, in favor of saying those things which are demonstrable. But when we're in the realm of experience, the demonstrable is ineffable. Like it's always like sand in the hand, you know, the more you clutch at it, the more you lose it. And I think we need to own the fact that we are doing something partial in
Yes,
both senses. It's coming from us and it's incomplete.
of
And
course.
if we do that, and we're open and honest about this partiality and
Mhm,
where this imagination is coming from, I think we
mhm.
can produce something valuable.
Yeah, of course. I'm very, very happy listening to you because I'm having all the time that trouble all the time. And Augusto asked for that yesterday, in fact. And I know you're very tired. I just want to read a question that is in YouTube. And while I'm looking for it, I remember uh, Ivik Sanya, which I read some days before, and she said that history is about silent possibilities, like finding silent possibilities. And I liked that idea because we are always working with silences that may have their many, many possibilities to imagine. So I think
Mm.
that's interesting. And Matthews Bonfin asks, I would like to know if Rob has insights to think about pain and love.
Pain and love. I mean, together.
Yeah, together.
Well,
Well,
yeah. I mean, I've written a lot about both, and I've written a lot about both at the same time. So if you want a full answer, go check out my
yeah.
last book, Knowing Pain. But I can give you a kind of brief answer, which I think is to the point of this presentation. And
Mhm,
I've said this many times in different venues. So people go looking for love in the archives far more than they go looking for pain.
mhm,
And um, what I say to people who go looking for love in the archives is that they are quite likely to find it. But if you set out to look for love in the archives, you run the risk of already having decided what love is because you've set out to search for something in particular. And when you limit your idea of what you want to find to what you already conceive love to be, then you will miss all the things that love can be and has been, that
mhm,
aren't shown up by that kind of search. Now, I'm aware of a practical problem here, which is that basically none of us gets the opportunity to just be in an archive and read. We all have targets, right? We all have timelines and we all have research questions. And this is the nature of the way that funding works. But in an ideal world, our question would not precede our research. Our research would form our question. What I found when I was looking for pain in the archive with the same risks and the same problems, but with a fair degree of learned openness to what that concept could be. When I went looking for pain, I found love when I wasn't looking for it. And I found all kinds of interesting, very situated experiences and practices of love, especially religious love, but also erotic, um, that were tied to situated concepts of pain, which are completely lost to us in a kind of global north way. Um, I won't go into the details. They're on the record. But I think that relationship, which sounds obscure, is very indicative of the possibilities of the unfamiliarity of the past when you're not guided by pre-made categories for what these things are or are supposed to be.
Well, thank you very much. We just want to thank you again. This was a wonderful talk and very suggestive, and you are giving us many, many things to think about. So thank you very much, and we hope this is just the first time we have you here with us in Históricas at UNAM. Thank you, and please go to sleep and have a good night after
Thanks.
these days.
Next time I'll be with you in person, I hope.
Yes, I'm sure we will do it. We will work it out. Thank you very much. Y bueno, muchas gracias a todas las personas que nos acompañaron hoy, que nos van a acompañar después en la transmisión que estará en línea. Muchas gracias, Alonso, por todo el apoyo, Alfredo, que nos dieron a lo largo de estos meses para poder transmitir y para que todo funcionara bien. Gracias a Mari Carmen del Instituto de Históricas, a todas las personas que han hecho posible que este ciclo de conferencias de historia, las emociones y la experiencia pues haya sido tan exitoso, tan sugerente y también una motivación para acercar a todas las personas que hablan español a conocer autores que de pronto no están traducidos al español y que sin duda es indispensable conocer para empezar a enriquecer también nuestra propia historiografía y para dialogar y también poder nosotros pues aportar aquello que se hace en lengua española, castellana. Así que muchísimas gracias, Susana Sosenski. En nombre de Susana, muchas gracias y Susana, muchas gracias a ti también por esta experiencia tan buena de haber organizado juntas una vez más algo tan importante y tan bonito para el campo historiográfico que estamos explorando y abriendo en México. Muchas gracias a todas, gracias Natalia y gracias a quienes nos acompañan en la sala y bueno, pues hasta muy pronto. Una cosa nada más, recuerden que se abre ya el Call for Papers para el Congreso de SHE, que será el próximo año en la Ciudad de México, así que ténganlo muy presente, ya está el Call for Papers y estamos esperando sus propuestas. Gracias, otra vez gracias Rob, thank you very much, see you very soon.